Third question today. David, how would you feel about instituting required military service, but also giving people the option of doing some kind of organized national service instead of serving? You know, I would not be against mandatory service of some kind for everybody, regardless of economic background, regardless of all factors. My concern in the United States would be that we would screw it up big time, right? Because there are lots of places. I mean, look, say what you want about Israel's foreign policy. Israel has a mandatory service, which I think it used to be 3 years for men and 2 years for women. I think it might have been reduced to 2 years for men and a year and a half for women, where you do basic training. Everybody does it. You become trained in sort of military basics, et cetera. You can say very clearly, very early on, I'm sort of like a pacifist, or I object to really going in the direction of being trained for a military conflict because I wouldn't participate in it, period. And you can work in a hospital, you can work in social service, you can work in a lot of other areas, which I would argue almost even aside from the military, what about just mandatory social service of some kind for people? Ideologically, I'm okay with it. In practice in the United States, I'd be really concerned that we screw it up and it leads to further militarization of the country, which is the absolute last thing that we need in the United States. And also, it is basically the reinstituting of a draft. So because of the history of the United States as having had a draft and then getting rid of the draft, even if you're creating something different now, where the idea is military service or some kind of national or social service, because of the history of the United States, I think it would be really problematic sort of emotionally for the country. So I think that I'm up for the idea of this being done in countries in general in some amorphous way. But I think there's no way to do it now in the United States and not have just a disastrous situation.
Yeah, I think I would be against mandatory service because it sounds like big government, and I don't
Really?
necessarily want to force people who are like 18, 19 years old into doing something like this.
Oh my goodness.
But I think what would work is making something like joining the Peace Corps for a year, joining AmeriCorps, or getting involved in the military for 1 year or two, a prerequisite to get into college. So private and public universities across the country have this universally agreed upon system by which those who apply have to have spent 1 year or two in some sort of service.
Let
I
me play
think that
devil's
makes a
advocate.
little bit more sense.
You said you don't like the big government idea of the government forcing you to do these things. Wouldn't the government have to force the private colleges to adopt the policy?
No.
So you're
Private
saying
college? No.
the public colleges could choose not to adopt it? Because
Yeah.
that kind of defeats the purpose of your idea.
Yeah, a little bit. I would have to think that through a little bit. But
Yeah.
maybe it's just like, like you send in your grades from your high school and you have to meet a certain benchmark in order to get in.
Yeah.
And maybe you have to
gotta have a
participate
year
in
of
some
something.
extracurriculars in order to get to an elite school or even a public college. This should be one of those things, I think.
Interesting. That might be an interesting way of implementing it. I think, though, that if you actually want it to be universal and not just public colleges, you've got to force the private ones to do it, which is not that
There
different.
could be some exceptions, I think.
Yeah.
We'll work through it together
We'd
after
have
the
to think
show.
about it. Yeah, after the show, we'll talk about it. Great questions this week. Send your questions in to me via Twitter. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman. We've got a great bonus show for you today, and we are off on Monday. Pat, don't come in on Monday. I've been telling Pat for weeks. He keeps talking about Monday's show, and I'm like, do not come in here because I won't be here for Memorial Day. But we will be back on Tuesday or today's bonus show, which is really, really great.